Thank you so much. The basics, before you actually need to see anything on the screen, is that I'm interested in talking to you today about the 4 short stories that are now part of the set texts. You'll be aware that there's a little bit of a distinction now with how we're doing the short stories for National 5 and for Higher, and that is what I'm interested in talking about today. In particular, my goal is to sort of introduce you to the 4 stories that are now on offer to you, give you a bit of background as to what the authors are up to what the rough summaries of the stories are, before I tell you some of the reasons I think they're good, some of the reasons I think they're useful and interesting to students, and then my final focus is on how they connect. How do these stories interact with one another, with an eye to helping you out for that lovely 8-mark, 10-mark question at the end of your Part 1 paper in your National 5 and Highers? That is the goal for today. So, fantastic. Let's get started then with our stories. I'll introduce you the 4 stories, and I've decided to do them in alphabetical order by the author's surname, so I cannot be accused of favoritism. The first up, we have Kirsty Logan. Kirsty is a Glasgow-based writer, and her story, Things My Wife and I Found in Our House, is one of the stories we've got on offer now. Based in Glasgow, Logan has 3 novels now, about 4 short story collections, an Audible original, heaps of short stories, so loads of material for students who really enjoy this one to explore further. What they all tend to have in common is a real interest in magic. There's undercurrents of witches, mermaids, men who turn to stone really come through in her fiction. But maybe what's most notable is that queer women are largely at the centre of her stories in some really exciting ways. The story we have for us today is no exception. The collection that this story comes from is called Things We Say in the Dark, which was billed to us as a collection of feminist horror stories. It leans into horror in a big way. You'll find all of the characters are kind of named after horror movie female characters. In this, I think it's from Resident Evil, a version. Alice and Rain are characters in these horror films, reimagined for us in a new context. The overall tone of the collection is pretty dark, as you might get a hint at with this particular story, but it's got a really interesting structure if you wanted to explore it further. It's not just a collection of short stories. There are little liminal moments where the author interjects and tells you about the process of writing them until you realise that that author's actually having a really stressful time in Iceland. Some really fun stuff happening. When we approach our story that we're interested in, our main character and narrator is Rain, who has just inherited with their partner a house from their partner Alice's now deceased grandmother. Great news, except it's not. What the problem is that as they are renovating the place and doing it up, they come across an increasingly unnerving series of items. A ring made of sea glass, a human liver in a jar. Things escalate for us, and we ultimately learn that they are being haunted by a kelpie, the Scottish folkloric creature. This is a bit stressful. They finally understand the truth of the haunting, and they try and get rid of all of the items, tossing them in the sea, and the story ends with them returning home, hopeful, and then finding some of that kelpie's mane draped across the doorknob. Yeah, see, you're hooked. What's really exciting about this story, I think in particular, is Logan builds a really wonderful sense of atmosphere. And one of the ways she does that is this wet, wet, wet feeling that we get throughout the whole story. What you have is the walls of the house are damp, the bedding is damp, the smell is of seawater and then seaweed, we get a bit of a mouldering sense. And atmospherically, you build up all this sensory stickiness. Whether the kelpie is being creating this sense of damp or is using it as a way to get into the house, we find that water becomes a really big deal. The most violent and frightening scene of this story takes place in a bath full of water in the bathroom. And so water comes through as a really great image, a really great motif throughout this whole story. It's a really wonderful, helpful kind of atmosphere. To look at our second story, I've got George Mackay Brown's. I've got A brief introduction to him if you're not familiar. He was from 1921. He was born in Stromness in Orkney. And what was fun about his time period is that he was really engaging with a lot of very interesting writers in Scotland of the time. There's a lot of fantastic contemporaries of his that he met during his time in Edinburgh. When he passed away in 1996, it was as somebody who was highly revered in Scottish literature. He was a hugely celebrated poet with an OBE, and there's a reason his works are still enjoyed and taught today. His story that we've got on the curriculum is Andrina, and it's a personal favourite. Andrina was my grandmother's name, so there's your Scottish connection coming already. In this story, we meet Captain Bill Torvald. He is an old man. He lives on a fictional island in a state of relative isolation, and now he's retired from seafaring. He doesn't hang out with really anyone apart from Andrina, a charming young woman who visits him in the sort of late afternoons, early evenings, and makes sure that his fire's on and he's looked after and conversing with someone. But after a bad bout of illness, Bill wakes up and is upset that Andrina hasn't been to visit. He goes into town, he asks what's been happening to her, and everyone thinks he is mad. They've never met this woman before. None of them have ever clapped eyes on her. She doesn't exist. When he returns home, he's received a letter. It's about 5 months post-dated. It's old. It's come from Australia. And it's from a woman that he had a liaison with in his younger, more vulnerable years, letting him know that the child that they had together that he abandoned had a child, and that child was called Andrina. And she's dead. What we get is an introduction to a ghost story. Who was visiting Torvald all that time? How could he have possibly imagined a woman who exactly fits the description of this granddaughter he never knew he had? It's a wonderful play with loss and regret and ghosts in a really fun new context. When I say Andrina brightened Bill Torvald's day, I absolutely mean it. One of the great things that Mackay Brown does in this story is he plays with light. Andrina is someone who lights his lamp. That's the second line of the story. We come straight in with this idea of her association with firing, blazing warmth. She opens the window and brings in fresh air. Without her, the room is foggy. She's associated with a really wonderful sense of freshness, light, warmth in a very dark, very nasty winter. What's fun is that even when Andrina leaves, people who are associated with her build this quality. If you read this, Bill doesn't like his postman. He doesn't like his postman at all. But when he thinks he has information about Andrina's whereabouts, all of a sudden he becomes a messenger of light. He becomes this beacon of hope. What's fun about this is Andrina comes across as hugely angelic, hugely kind, but it also connects back to Bill's torrid affair with Sigrid all those years ago on the island, where it was during a never dark summer. You see where we're going with this? What's really fun about it is that it means that when Andrina learns the truth about her grandfather, about how he treated her grandmother all those years ago, she leaves him with a cold kiss, and that's why she is never visited again. That's why he was left with a horrible, debilitating cold. Andrina is warmth and light and joy, and without her, things are a little bit rubbish for Torvald. To come to our third story, we meet Helen McClory. This time we have an Edinburgh-based writer working now. She's got 2 great novels and a couple of short story collections, Mayhem and Death and On Edges of Vision, and lots of flash fiction that you can find online. This is one of the things I really enjoy about McClory's work, is that she leans really hard into very short, fragmentary pieces of writing. Very fun to study in short, sharp bursts, because they lean into such strong images, and they ask the reader to do a lot of work in figuring out what on earth it might mean. When we are interested in this story from Mayhem and Death, we've got another short story collection that has an interesting sort of framing narrative. This story collection begins with a story that introduces a mourning mother, and then the final novella of the story introduces the character that she is mourning. And it's hinted for us that everything in between was written by that dead woman. So there's a fun play with authorship. It's another great story to look at in context. So there's more wiggle room to explore this if you like it. Speaking of this story, A Voice Spoke to Me at Night. It does exactly what it says on the tin. We have a lonely, unnamed narrator who is living above a Tesco Metro in a historyless part of town, and all of a sudden they start hearing a strange, Chaucer-esque voice through the mirror on the sort of fitted wardrobe in their rented flat. They eventually meet this figure through the mirror. This is a plague victim. This is someone who is the only surviving person in their village from centuries ago, speaking a version of Scots and Latin that is completely indecipherable to our narrator until they record it and go away and work through Google Translate. When they work out eventually what this person in the mirror was talking about, they learn their whole story, and they ultimately think that the extreme loneliness they felt has created this portal through time and maybe space so that they can be together. Oh, makes you cry, doesn't it? What's so fun about this is that McClory tells us almost nothing about our narrator that we can really pin down. We don't have a name for them, we don't have a gender that's particularly clear. We know nothing about their job other than the fact that they don't socialise with anyone there, and it's maybe a bone of contention with their boss. They are essentially blank, and the things that they're interested in are relatively generic for our generation. They like crime podcasts, and then a podcast about food when they're too scared about the crime podcast. They're watching other people play video games online. It's incredibly contemporary, and all of a sudden we start to feel like maybe they stand in for all of us. Maybe they represent a generational experience of technology and potentially of isolation as well. It's very fun to be able to see how this character narrator perceives themselves versus how we might think of them instead. For our final story, we meet Duncan Williamson. He was born as part of a travelling community, and what's fantastic about his work is that his travels have directly inspired it. He and his family, musicians and poets and creatives in their own right, would tour, gathering folkloric oral story traditions. And it's something that he and his wife, Linda Williamson, collected in several collections. So you can read a lot of these stories that would otherwise not be documented, not be recorded for us in a way that we could access today. When he passed away in 2007, it was again as someone hugely respected. This is someone who's done some phenomenal work in preserving oral travelling traditions, and I think it's worthwhile noting. His story that he's contributed for us is Death in a Nut. And it fits in wonderfully with this idea of story collection. This is not an original Williamson. This is his take on a story that he has gathered. It's his version of it. In this story, we meet the teenage Jack, and he learns that his mother is about to die. And he meets Death on the beach on his way to collect her. Death is an old man, and Jack takes advantage. He hits Death, who suddenly begins to transform magically into a tiny, tiny little version of himself. So small that Jack can cram him into the hollowed body of a nut and hurl him into the ocean, thereby saving his mother and ridding the world of death. As you might imagine, there are consequences. All of a sudden, nothing can die. Eggs can't even be cracked. Carrots cannot even be chopped. And he has to really learn a hard lesson about how death is actually ultimately a very important part of our life. There's a didactic lesson here for us. His mother is ultimately spared. He finds Death in the nut, he releases him, he gives him back his scythe, and he says, I was wrong. And we learn that Death says, all right, I'll let your mother have a wee bit longer, just for you being a good boy. What is really wonderful about this story is it paints such a vibrant image for us. We get such beautiful use of space. Death, when Jack meets him across the beach, is coming just as the day sort of breaks, just that liminal period between night and day. So we really get that sense of transition, of movement, of change. When Jack has killed Death, has ruined him, thrown him into the ocean, what we have is a world that's full of warmth and fertility and life. We have a fire burning in the stove, and we have nests full of eggs ready to eat, but not really. At the entire way that Williamson tells us with is incredibly engaging. There's a use of onomatopoeia and repetition. When he's describing the waves, they're not just coming in and coming out. They're a whooshing and a whooshing and a whooshing. There's a real sense of really wanting you involved in this story, and I think it's something that Williamson does incredibly beautifully. So, that's her 4. You like them? Yes, you do. Of course you do. I would now like to have a bit of a chat about how we can think about connecting these stories. What do they share in common that can help us when we come to that 8 or 10 mark question? What is it that they have in common? You might be familiar with this idea here now. Previously, when you've been encountering this part of the exam paper for short stories, you've been comparing several Anne Donovans for a chance. Now what we're doing is we're taking all 4 of these stories and we're thinking about them as if they were from one author. We're thinking about what they share in common rather than 5 texts from the same author. Does that make sense? What we're interested in is how these connect here. And what I think is fantastic is that there's a huge amount of diversity in these stories. We have 2 writers from 2 different cities in the Central Belt, someone from up in the islands, someone who's travelled. We have different genders accounted for, we have queer representation, and there's a real sense of a little bit of something for everyone. But that being said, loads in common. One of the things I think we really see here is this idea about the narrative styles and character. I think it is fair to say the exam questions are going to change in accordance with the themes and ideas that come up most closely, most interestingly in these stories. But if you look through previous papers, some of the stuff that comes up again and again, some of the stuff that you might be familiar with teaching, is this idea of character being of key import to us. It's something we're constantly talking about. And I think these stories still do that. So if you're familiar with teaching with this perspective, we can still do it. Rain's narrative and character is especially interesting. She's incredibly conversational with us. She begins her story with "and," as if we were just chatting. She continues from where she left off. In terms of her personality, she feels incredibly romantic, incredibly imaginative. When she finds a clarty ring embedded in dirt, lost in the floorboards, she likes to think of it as a gift from this deceased grandmother, thinks it was left there for her on purpose. No, obviously not. What we get, though, is a story that this fanciful character, it's kind of organised and grounded in some interesting ways that mean her reliability isn't too much of a problem. The story is organised by numbered sections. Every new object that these characters find in the house is given a number and named. And so that it's organised in a way that feels reliable, authoritative to us, it feels coherent. We also get Alice, who's much more level-headed, much more grounded. When Alice says, "Oh, isn't this bonny, I've put it on my wedding finger," Alice says, "That looks like you got it out of a vending machine." We get a sense of contrast. This incredible, fanciful character, her narrative is rooted in some very real reflections from other, more cynical people, and through this sense of ordering. So those are really useful for us. No, I've not done that. We have another first-person narrator in a voice. This is someone else who's also had a really interesting experience that might be hard to articulate. This character, the way that this person is, we can tell that they're not, the life of the party. They're not a stand-up member of the community. And this sort of sense of self-deprecation in the way that they describe themselves is really interesting. I'm not very interesting or powerful, not even in my imagination. I can't imagine anything exciting happening to me. They're a bit low on themselves. But what we have is, like many of us, a really believable engagement with the strange. Instead of completely following into this man in the mirror, what we have is immediately a disbelief. When our narrator first encounters this person in the mirror, whose name is Malcolm or something like it, Mal something, as I'll call him for the rest of today, they disbelieve it. They do not believe it's happened. They go and have a pee and they brush their teeth and they come back and he's still there. They think, I'm either mad or I'm not, and I don't know what's worse. So they're acknowledging to us as an audience that they're like, I know this is crazy, but it's definitely what happened. What's another great piece of evidence about this is that they say, well, I don't know what that man in the mirror's name was. He said it and it wasn't familiar, and I feel like if this was entirely made up in my subconscious, I would have picked an easier name. If I were going to come up with it myself, it would maybe be a bit more typical. And so we get another really fun story that's playing with this idea of how believable, how reliable are these narrators? Are these real people whose strange things are happening to, or is there something to do with the psychological here? By the close of this story, this narrator is kind of transformed in that really lovely way we like to see in our short stories. We like to see character development. By the close of our story, the character who would not want to hang out with anyone at work now says, I would have done anything for Mal, the man in the mirror. I would have done anything for him. There's suddenly a huge amount of emotional connection, a huge amount of love, and a huge amount of human connection that we didn't have at the start of the story. And it's all felt through their narration. Where we meet Bill Torvald, we get something interesting as well. This is another chap who's had another interesting experience. And the way that he explains himself is really fun. Bill thinks of himself as a tough old salt and a tough old seaman. Those are two words that he uses to describe himself. But having retired from seafaring, he's now ultimately an old man. And his experiences of that kind of aging are really rough for him. When we begin this story, we start in the present tense. Andrina comes to visit him until we realize that actually she's not come since last February. She actually hasn't been there in quite some time. This is actually him reflecting on the experience with a bit of retrospect, a bit of hindsight. When Bill is reflecting on his experience with Sigrid, this woman he impregnated and abandoned and still has some feelings about, the way he speaks about that is incredibly telling. He switches immediately to the third person. This is not a story of when I was a young man. This is the story of a young man and a young woman, generically. He's cagey about what they got up to on that beach that summer. We don't hear anything precisely other than communings and shy touches. Personally, don't think they were that shy. What we have is euphemistic language around the pregnancy. He never uses the word himself. He never touches on the term baby. Instead, what we get is a tremulous, perilous, secret thing that becomes a burden as he walks away from her. What's really compelling about this is that Torvald directly acknowledges us as an audience. He says, you might think of this as a crude tale of country manners, so I'll tell you about it. He's acknowledging that we will be a less judgmental audience, potentially, than maybe Andrina, maybe someone else closer to him. But he still, even when he thinks we're more generous as a crowd, he still can't quite say the words himself about what he actually did. There's a real sense of regret, a real sense of revisionism, and distancing himself from this past. So his character becomes a really interesting study, really done well throughout the narrative. So these three first-person narrators offer us something really interesting. Through the narration, we get more about the characters themselves than maybe we could get from a third person. And there's lots of room to interpret their reliability. For Rain, her interpretation of how the Kelpie came to haunt them and what the situation is a little bit confusing. Are there other ways to think about it? So they're really fun. There's a lot to pick at and a lot of different ways you and your students can choose to look at these stories. When we approach Williamson's, though, we've not got a first-person narrator. We've got a slightly different approach. We have a conversational outsider's narrative voice telling us about a story that this person is not involved in. At first glance, the language might stand out to us. We are seeing Williamson use a variation of Scots Romani, Scots cant. So we get Traveller's Scots in particular, which is really fun to see written down. More than this, though, we have a writing style that's incredibly personable. Williamson writes that Jack's experience took place about this time o' year now. And this time kind of places us in the same environment as the storyteller. We kind of feel like not just we're hearing about Jack's story, but we're hearing the story be told directly to us in some sort of fire escape in January. We're involved in a few different layers of storytelling here. Because we're interested in this oral tradition of storytelling, it's being captured for us quite precisely. All of the cadences of this text feel as if they are being read aloud to us, rather than something that has been carefully curated as a written piece. What's fun in terms of character in this story is that we meet Jack, the most generic of all men. This is a staple tale in folklore and fairy tales. You might have met him on a beanstalk, perchance, climbing up a hill with Jill. Jack is basic. He is how we tell fairy tales and folklore stories. But Williamson still manages to take this stock character and imbue with a bit more of his own personal personality. What we get is someone with a specific relationship with his mother. He brings her a tea every morning. There's a sense of devotion and dedication. He's so upset at the prospect of living without her that he really is angry when he encounters death on that beach. We get a sense of his own personality, despite the fact that he's presented to us as a universal figure, just like McClory's unnamed protagonist, unnamed narrator might feel for us. What is great if we're thinking about character transformation, character development over the story, is that Jack goes from absolutely lack of remorse about what he did to death, to acknowledging that actually probably I shouldn't have done that, to completely saying I was wrong. Jack understands throughout the course of the story that we need death, and it changes how he behaves. At the end of the story, he gives Death back his scythe, freshly polished, freshly mended, as if to really underscore this idea of, I understand now. I get the gist. I get it. So all four of these stories, with these four very different characters, are still able to give us something interesting about who they are, how they think of themselves, and how their personalities shape our stories. The next thing I'm interested in talking about is something that's quite familiar to, I think, many of us who are interested in Scots literature, and this concept of the supernatural, following some proud literary traditions. What I have here for you on the screen, just here as well, this is a still from Bill Forsyth's Andrina short film. It runs at about 45 minutes and is free on YouTube. Just think 45 minutes is quite handy for a lot of us, so I thought I would mention it. What we have is a real interest in the supernatural, and I'd like to just briefly talk about how these stories all use this. For Logan, we lean into the dark, nasty underbelly of how folklore traditions work very quickly. We're not interested in fairy politics, we're interested in how a Kelpie will kill you, which is maybe a bit darker than we're quite used to. While many of the other stories use supernatural elements to give us positive transformational experiences, Logan's transformation isn't a positive one, and she is interested in using magic to build a real big sense of dread. Rain is attacked in the bath in that new house, and in the build-up to that scene, there's this really wonderful section where she hears her heart boom, 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 steady as footsteps, steady as hoofbeats. Yeah. What's fabulous about this is that we get this beautiful repetition. We're talking about the heart, which, as we all know, races in times of dangers and stops when we die, perhaps by being drowned in the bath by a malevolent force. We see her organize her thoughts. She takes this idea of footsteps and then goes, no, it's closer to hoofbeats. And guess what has hooves? Yes! This is where we get something really interesting. What Rain is experiencing is a really terrifying scene, and therefore we get this long, breathless sentence. This is just one really great example, I think, about how the supernatural is used in a really scary way. None of this that happens to Rain is tangible. None of it is evidenceable, really, and that's what makes it all the more haunting, this intangibility. It's just sounds, it's just feelings. Oh. What we get in Brown's story is, if we're interpreting Andrina as a ghost story, which I would say yes, we get a foreshadowing to this final conclusion from very early in the story. Mackay Brown uses the word ghost 4 times in this story to refer to things like waiting for Sigrid's return to the island or trying to ask the postman for help. Bill is thinking about ghosts and haunting all the way throughout his story. If we look as well about how we interpret Andrina, she only ever appears as we hit twilight, as the light starts to fade and the night starts to begin. That liminal period again is when she is occupying time and space on Earth. When Bill has sort of suppressed his feelings about the past, Andrina being confronted with her brings up all this regret, all this experience in the past. Had he not abandoned Sigrid, is this kind of love and community and care something that he might have been able to experience in his life more? This haunting is not just a ghost story, but ultimately about how our past choices continue to alter our lives. Williamson, when we encounter him, he's personifying death in a really simplistic way. Death is an ugly old man. But he's a man. He can be spoken with, he can be interacted with. He walks the same shores that we do. It's a humanizing choice, and it makes death feel more personable, less like a frightening skeletal concept. His age, being old, hints at this idea of an internal presence, the length of time that he's been performing this very nasty but very necessary job. He's been around the block. He's been here a while. The events of McClory's story, if we're interested in thinking about this in terms of the supernatural, she has this inexplicable, unexplainable, magical portal that reveals the human connections that we ultimately share with others in our species, regardless of the massive amount of time and distance that might separate us. We are still human. We are still together on this. What we see when we look at all four of these stories together is that none of them are using the supernatural for the sake of fantasy and adventure and the politics of fairy kingdoms. What we're interested in when we use the supernatural in these stories is exposing and exploring human concerns, big, normal problems like grief and loss. Which brings me to my next slide. One of the big themes we see so far in preparing for our 8 and 10 markers are these understandings of important relationships, impacts of loss, important human issues. And my argument for you is that the biggest human issue of all, surely, is loss, how we cope with our relationships with each other when they are severed in such a way. It's crystal clear to us in Death in a Nut that we have death personified. This is obviously going to be a theme. Jack cannot bear the thought of losing his mother at such a young age, but in attempting to prevent those natural cycles of life and death, it breaks the earth. It ruins everything. It's completely untenable. He learns about the natural rhythms and about the relationships with those we have loved and lost being absolutely necessary. When we think about Logan's things, we learn that this couple, Rain and Alice, have come into the house of this grandmother, but not simply. Rain and Alice have been visiting her for years, but she's never quite understood or respected their relationship, calling Rain a friend, even after so many years together, even after so many visits. We get a sense that maybe there's an underlying homophobia, a lack of acceptance that is making this a sticky kind of grief to be working through. Working through anyone's house after they've passed is a really difficult job, and to do so while still having strange feelings about the person you've lost is a really wonderful story, a really interesting concept. When we think about George Mackay Brown, we get some very interesting stuff. Bill is mourning a woman he has never physically actually met. Andrina has never visited him as a physical, corporeal being. How can you feel about this? What's wonderful in this story is that Bill's experiences are so much about loneliness. And this is what I think becomes a really wonderful comparison with McClory's A Voice Spoke to Me at Night. Mal something in A Voice Spoke to Me at Night has obviously suffered unimaginable loss beyond a scale that any of us can really comprehend. And what that means is that he is incredibly, incredibly lonely. Both of these stories do this wonderfully. McClory's narrator does not seem to understand how lonely they actually are. It's subtext for us that we pick up on the fact that they're on Tinder just to look at some faces. Oh, doesn't that break your heart? They can't help but feel that the reason that Mal could see them through time was the force of his loneliness. Do we think that actually maybe this was a bit reciprocal? Do we think that actually maybe both of them are desperately, desperately alone? For Mackay Brown, we get this sense of loneliness coming through super powerfully. We're on an island. It's a beautiful image of isolation. But even within that, Bill Torvald is on his own. He lives in an isolated part. It's 2 miles for him to trudge into the village. The postmistress said, "You better take good care of yourself, you all alone up there." When Torvald returns to the island 50 years after abandoning Sigrid, he's only vaguely remembered. He doesn't have long-standing connections. What's wonderful about these stories is that they expose to us just how desperately this loss constitutes itself in loneliness. For Bill, when he's asking around about Andrina, it becomes clear that no one knows what he's talking about because he's never spoken with them. In the entire winter that Andrina's been visiting, he's not had one chat about her. No one's heard about her before. Does that strike you as a man who's maybe lacking in community? This is what these stories do wonderfully well. They really paint such vibrant images with such big themes like this. So I've attempted to look at character narration, to look at the supernatural, to look at loss and grief, but there are so many more ways to talk about these, and I'm already over time. If you are interested in talking about powerful emotions, I think we have them. If we're interested in looking at setting a story in Scotland, and specifically what that might do for a story, if we're thinking about how we think about the past, how we think about our own pasts, our own memories, or just even tiny details like death existing as a human person. These are all wonderful choices. Oh, and I've not finished my sentence. Don't look at that. There is so much in these stories that you can tease out depending on what your interests are, depending on what your students are interested in. And I think that's what's so great about them. They are vibrant, wonderful pieces. They have a lot in common in the big picture, and in the smaller, granular details, there's a lot in common too. I'd like to argue, ultimately, that these stories provide us a really wonderful selection. They all work well and are all punchy as stories on their own. Because there's a bit of variety in them, you're definitely going to find something that works for your classroom, something that all students can really get their teeth into. Because they have so much in common, all these wonderful connections, there's a wonderful way to link them all together. I foresee good marks in the 8 to 10 marker for all of you. I think there is room here. Yep, let's do that. Yeah.